Want to buy some bonds? Biden's radioactive 14th Amendment bonds are the real debt ceiling Armageddon. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about President Joe Biden. He's threatening to invoke the 14th Amendment to issue more Treasury bonds above the congressionally prescribed $31.4 trillion national debt ceiling. This is set up as an act of Congress. They've been doing this for about a century, where the government is not allowed to borrow any more money than what Congress legally sets forth under the law. And this is actually, I think, done under the 14th Amendment, which states that the public, the debt, the validity thereof shall not be questioned, but it's authorized by law under the 14th Amendment. But you have to hear from Joe Biden himself, where he's basically taking this new authority onto himself, where he thinks he can actually issue Treasury debt without any vote in Congress. Take a listen to this.
Number 4, I'm looking at the 14th Amendment as to whether or not we have the authority. I think we have the authority. The question is, could it be done and invoked in time that it would not be appealed and as a consequence past the date in question and still default on the debt? That's a question that I think is unresolved. And so the point is, I'm hoping and I believe that when we sat in the room with all the leaders from Mitch McConnell on, and they said, we will not default, period. We will not default. That's what all, including Kevin McCarthy, said, we will not default. And so I'm assuming that we mean what we say, and we'll figure out a way to not have to default.
So that's President Joe Biden right there. And again, I think he is absolutely wrong about this. I do not believe that any president of the United States can borrow above the whatever Congress sets forth at the debt as the debt ceiling. Currently, it's $31.4 trillion. And we're going to just jump into my piece here. It's very important that the Congress gets this right, but also that the country gets this right, because otherwise we're going to be issuing radioactive bonds onto the markets. And I think that's going to be a real financial Armageddon. Biden says, I'm looking at the 14th Amendment. I think we have the authority to raise the debt ceiling without Congress. Unbelievable. Here he says it. This was in Hiroshima, Japan, for the G7 meeting on May 21. At a press conference. You can also look up his remarks on whitehouse.gov. I recommend, if you want to keep up with what President Biden is doing to violate the Constitution, the best source for that is whitehouse.gov, and you'll get a pretty much a very accurate account of all of his unconstitutional comings and goings here. And he's outlining his view that the president of the United States has the power to add as much new debt above the legally prescribed $31.4 trillion debt ceiling established under law as he deems fit under Section 4 of the 14th Amendment. And we have that right here. I wanted to read it to you so that you can understand what is in the 14th Amendment, Section 4, because I think it's very important to this debate. It states, quote, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor shall any state assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave. But all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. So this does two things. It establishes that the Union debt that was incurred during the Civil War must be paid, and it states that the debt of the Confederacy, that will never be paid, and nor shall any state assume it, nor can Congress assume that debt. And so it establishes that there is valid debt. The only valid debt is that which is authorized by law. And then under Section 5, it states that the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So very clear when you combine that the only valid debt is that which is authorized by law under Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, and that Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article, it is perfectly clear that Joe Biden has no authority to increase the debt ceiling under his own authority under the 14th Amendment. That's just wrong. Here's the most recent debt ceiling increase, joint resolution relating to increasing the debt limit. This was on December 16, 2021. Quote, resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. Note 31 U.S.C. 3101. Note that the limitation under Section 3101, subsection B of Title 31 United States Code, as most recently increased by Public Law 11750, 31 U.S.C. 3101 note, is increased by $2.5 trillion. Approved December 16, 2021. This passed the House. This passed the Senate. It was signed into law by President Joe Biden. He knows that he's not able to increase the debt ceiling under his own authority. That's absolutely patently absurd. Again, ratified in 1868. At the time, the 14th Amendment, this section was to guarantee the bonds that had been issued by the federal government to pay for the Civil War, quote, including debts incurred for payments of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, and to simultaneously repudiate the debts of the Confederacy. The second part of the section wiped away the Confederacy's debt, quote, neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred by the Confederacy during the Civil War, because they're going to be held illegal and void. And I say these provisions must be read consistently. So the debts incurred by the federal government, authorized under law by Congress, quote, shall not be questioned. And the debts incurred by the Confederacy, quote, shall be illegal and void, end quote. Neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred by the Confederacy. Therefore, the debt obligations incurred by the federal government, authorized under law, must be paid, and those incurred by the Confederacy must never be paid. Now, let's see what happened to the Civil War debt of the Confederacy. This is from November 9, 1865. The rebel debts. This was a New York Times article, again from 1865. It starts, quote, the debts of the Confederate government contracted for the purposes of war and for all other purposes were swept away when the Confederacy fell. All its currency, bills, bonds, treasury notes, and promises to pay of every kind became worthless to the holders, even though these holders had given them real property or services of a positive value. After the fall of Richmond, $100 bills based on the faith and credit of the Confederacy were sold for a nickel cent apiece, and $1,000 notes were exchanged evenly for 3-cent shin plasters. There's little, if any, talk in any part of the South about assuming any part of the debt. Its magnitude is appalling, and the states of the South did not become responsible for it in their individual capacity. On its face, it was declared to be payable upon the establishment of the independence of the Southern Confederacy, thus linking its fortunes with that of the rebel government. But it was but logical that the Confederacy's credit should cease to have a value when the Confederacy itself ceased to have an existence. But there has appeared in many states, and it still appears in some, a strong party desirous of assuming the payment of the debts contracted by the various states individually in aid of rebellion while members of the Confederacy. And this goes on and on. But the whole purpose of the 14th Amendment was to prevent this from happening, to, just to knock the Confederate debts out, but also to get rid of the currency. People were still using the currency thereafter. But because Congress didn't authorize or assume that debt, it became worthless. It became a $100 note became worth a nickel. $1,000 note was worth a 3-cent shin plaster. And so that's what Joe Biden is going to do to our Treasury debt. He thinks he has the authority, but he's going to be issuing radioactive bonds under his authority. It's not under his authority. These are going to be toxic, bonds for the bond market. If you hit the debt ceiling, he says, yeah, we're going to increase the debt ceiling to 32 trillion or 40 trillion or 50 trillion or 100 trillion. Doesn't matter what he says. And then he starts issuing bonds from the Treasury. These are going to be radioactive bonds, and that's going to be a real financial Armageddon. Interest rates are going to skyrocket. It's going to be like the rebel debts. It's going to be worth a nickel for $100 note or something like that. So I think the prices are going to plummet. This will cause a financial crisis, worse than it would be if you just hit the debt ceiling and you just didn't have any more money to pay for other obligations besides the creditors. You'd almost be better off doing that. So right off the bat, one glaring issue for President Biden is the $31.4 trillion debt ceiling is currently established under law that Congress passed and the president signed into law. The debt ceiling cannot go higher without Congress. Here, Biden is attempting to remove Congress's clearly delineated role and power to, quote, enforce by appropriate legislation the provision of Section 4 that reads, quote, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law shall not be questioned. Meaning Congress could pass a law allowing the president or the Treasury to increase the debt limit, or it could pass a law saying there is no debt limit. But instead, what it has done for the past century is they say, we're going to set the debt ceiling. We're going to set the public debt limit. And then again, most recently is SJ Res 33 in December of 2021. It was set to $31.4 trillion. The Treasury cannot go above that, not without Congress. Again, that took it from 28.9 trillion to 31.4 trillion, not 31.5 trillion, not 31.6 trillion, not 50 trillion, and not 100 trillion. Here, Biden is suggesting that he can just keep increasing the debt ceiling for all time, absent any authority from Congress to do so. That is wrong. It is unconstitutional. And I don't think federal courts and the Supreme Court will let it fly. And that's why this is dangerous and also unprecedented and would be a genuine constitutional, but also a financial crisis, as a rogue treasury started issuing radioactive treasuries that were never authorized by Congress and would probably be struck down by federal courts, given the clear wording of both the 14th Amendment and SJ Res 33 from 2021. Now, Biden, he alluded to this possibility that it would go to court in his appeal in Hiroshima. That's a good place to talk about radioactive bonds, I guess. Quote, the question is, could it be done and invoked in time that it would not be appealed, and as a consequence, pass the date in question and still default on the debt? That's a question that I think is unresolved. Yeah, you think there might be a court appeal, Mr. President? Yeah, there's going to be a court appeal, and you think there's not enough time to do it? So here I think he's actually making an excuse for why he might not actually invoke the 14th Amendment to increase the debt ceiling. Because, he's trying to placate his base. He's basically saying, oh, yeah, you want to use the 14th Amendment. I think we have the authority to do that, but not so fast. I don't think we have time, and it might be appealed in the courts. Yeah, it's going to be struck down in the courts is what's going to happen there. That part, again, could be Biden making an excuse for why he would not be invoking the 14th Amendment, saying there's no time, there might be an appeal. But he cannot act arbitrarily like this. And to say that he can, to just invoke this authority, say I think we've got it. We've got this authority. Again, Section 5 of the 14th Amendment is perfectly clear. It states the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Not the president, not the Supreme Court, but Congress has the power to enforce the provision of Section 4 that states the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law shall not be questioned. So if anything, an honest reading of the 14th Amendment means the federal government must pay the debt authorized by law above all other obligations. So creditors get paid first out of existing revenue. No ifs, ands, or buts. There shouldn't be a default, not under the 14th Amendment. The validity of the public debt authorized by law shall not be questioned. Biden has to pay those bondholders, and he has to pay them first under the provisions. That is, if we're reading the 14th Amendment for what it means and how it treated Confederate debt and how it treated the Union debt. Those obligations incurred by the federal government must be paid under the amendment. You have to pay the debt, Mr. President. The 14th Amendment does not mean what you hope it means, Mr. President. You can't do whatever you want. You must act under law, under the Constitution. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.